Welcome back to another episode of the Bound to Improve podcast, where we read a book a week and we try to break down the challenging, complex ideas in that book and turn them into actionable steps for progress. My name is Chris Pound.
My name's Landon Eller, and the book that we decided to read this week was Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And to get right into it, the main theme of this book was the author used modern psychology tools to determine what a meaningful life is or should be, and like what ultimately makes us happy. So he presents these as principles that we can interpret how we want, rather than like a cookbook showing the steps that you need to make a certain recipe.
Yeah, he mentions that in order to have a joyful, happy, meaningful life, you can't follow a step-by-step guide on how to do that. It all comes from almost like personal experiences, or better yet, the optimal experiences that we all feel in order to get into that flow state.
Yeah, so before we go down, breaking down everything that he talked about, just a brief high level on the concept of flow. And this is when you are completely immersed in whatever activity that you're doing, and basically everything else about the world kind of blocks out, essentially. And he argues that this is the optimal experience, or is equivalent to true happiness, which was an interesting take.
Yeah, one of the key things that I took away from the book is that flow is not relaxing, it's more energizing and engaging, right? So when you are in a flow state, minutes start to turn into or feel like seconds, or hours feel like minutes, right? Time is really deceptive when you're in a flow state. So,
and we'll get into the conditions of what, like, when we lay out the parameters of what kind of induces that flow state.
When was the last time that you kind of felt like you were in a flow state to begin with?
So I would say it was, I'll give you two examples here, but I'm also going to flip it back on you.
Yeah.
And one was recently at work, and I was developing a process on how weeds were segmented and how they were bucketed, and like all of the processes that weaved in and out of there. So why was I in a flow state? I had a clear goal of being able to optimize the process and get as many cold emails out, because ultimately it's a numbers game.
Yeah.
There was constant feedback. I knew right away if the system wasn't working or not, because it simply wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Like the concept of time was gone.
Okay.
I was not self-conscious at all, so I had I was not thinking about myself at all. I was only thinking, my whole attention was on the task at hand, and that goes into like, I was fully
fully focused.
Fully focused.
So do you feel like it was more of a sense that you enjoyed what you were doing, or was it more of a sense that you were so narrowly focused on that one goal that all other distractions were quiet?
They work hand in hand, I think.
Gotcha.
And we'll get into that more, and maybe I'll do my second example when we get into it. But yeah, moving right into the next aspect here is he revisits the idea of happiness. And happiness is pursued for its own sake. So when you think about what people chase in life, whether that be serving people, fame, money, houses, whatever it is, they are pursuing those aspects because they're supposedly going to bring you happiness. And as we've talked about so many times throughout the podcast, it's not about the luck or external experiences that bring you happiness. It's more about how we interpret the experiences that we face.
And throughout the book, he mentioned that throughout evolution, we are hardwired to constantly be seeking for more, whether it's fame, wealth, success.
Basically, external rewards.
Yes, and that we are never fully content with where we're at. And I don't know if that's necessarily an issue, but I think in order to have a meaningful, joyful life, you need to appreciate the small things that you experience in the present time.
Yeah, and adding on to what you're saying, like take a student in college. Most of the time, people are going to school and they're studying hard to get good grades in class, or to get that validation from their parents, their professors, their classmates, or to get that next job. And those are all external validation. How many times is it because you actually love the subject that you're studying so hard for it?
Very seldomly, I find.
And that's what I think he was trying to argue, where we need to develop an internal meaning for what we're doing in order to get that happiness in terms of like interpreting our experiences.
Along with that, he mentions the phrase psychological entropy. When attention is fragmented and purposeless, we feel anxious and bored. So when you're able to fully focus all of your attention on one thing at a time and kind of see that thing all the way through, it supposedly brings you more joy and more happiness, and it leads to a more fulfilled life. Do you believe that? Or
I think I see where you're going with like the attention aspect, because if you don't have something to direct your attention in, that psychic entropy is going to set in, and that just brings upon all the negative ideas that you have stewing in the back of your mind, or all the negative experiences that you've faced in this past.
Your subconscious mind almost kind of takes over.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's vitally important to always remain in the present moment, right? Control what you can control and forget about the other things that you can't. Like my most favorite quote that I've ever read is from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, right? If there's a river flowing downstream and you throw a log into it, what happens to the log? It flows down the river, out of mind, out of sight. That's how it has to be, right? Because what has happened in your past is gone. There's nothing you can control about that, and there's nothing that you can change now in order to re-feel that. It's like they say never get back with an ex-girlfriend. Well, that's for a reason, right? Because you are never going to be able to experience the way you felt that first time around with that girlfriend, right? And so you're always going to be chasing that feeling again, but it will never be there because, like I said, like Marcus Aurelius said, once you throw a log into the river, it's gone. It's never coming back to you.
And I think, just to make sure I understand what you're saying here, is the outside validation that we're accustomed to, like we need that.
Yeah.
It goes back to what we've read so many times, like whether it be Marcus Aurelius or the multitude of other books, it comes down to knowing thyself.
Yeah.
And if you're able to do this, then everything else externally
falls into place.
Or it doesn't matter, because it's just, if you know internally what's happening, it doesn't matter. But this is hard because, one, there's no formula for it. It's not do this plus this and it's going to equal knowing yourself. And also there's like the outside environment is changing constantly, so you constantly have to adapt to what's going on in the external environment.
Yes.
So it's just very challenging too.
It is very challenging, and it's not something that you can just automatically pick up, right? I think it takes a lot of mental fortitude in order to finally get to the point where you are happy with yourself, regardless of what's happening socially or around in your environment. You are happy with where you're at in life because you've gotten to the point where you have peace within yourself. And I think that's a big part of it. You have to have peace within yourself in order to truly feel happy. If you can't conquer your own mind, you're not going to be able to do a lot in life, right? I think that's been a main subject in a lot of the self-help books that we've read so far, is that you have to be able to control your emotions and your thoughts. Otherwise, your brain will beat you in that battle.
Yeah. That's all I have for that section. Are you good?
Do you chase outcomes, or do you find yourself enjoying the process? I mean, thinking about back in high school when we used to play sports, we didn't have to go to the gym early in the mornings or late at nights in order to get extra work in, but we enjoyed it, right? We did it because we wanted to, not because anybody else was requiring us to, but simply because we found enjoyment in the work and the grind and the effort that we were putting into that sport. Do you find that you can still achieve that type of process in today's life, considering how much has changed since we've been in high school?
Well, I think it's more so the process than the outcomes anyways. Like going back to Dark Horse by Todd Rose.
Yeah.
Like I've enjoyed more so the grind, you can call it, rather than the outcomes it's created.
Yeah, it's more about the journey than the destination, right?
Yeah.
Because once you get to that summit, you may not even realize that that's not the top of the mountain, right? So again, it's important to stay in the present. But he mentioned earlier, it's like when you're walking down a rocky path, right? You're making sure that you don't slip and fall on a rock, but you also have to keep your head up and make sure that you're not going to walk off yourself a cliff, right? So you got to keep that in mind as well. So moving on to the anatomy of consciousness.
Yeah, and he started off and he said there's 2 layers. There's your biological processes layer. So when you're hungry, for example, your conscious is going to tell you you need to go get something to eat. Or if you're scared, it's going to enact the flight or fight syndrome. But then we also have the second layer, which is like a mental override. So, for example, take fasting for religious purposes. You're hungry, so your conscious is telling you to eat, but you're overriding that because you're doing it for a higher purpose. And it was just an interesting way that I thought he presented the idea of the conscious. And he did more so the study on not the anatomy or the brain waves that was emitted during certain activities. He was more focused on how you feel during certain activities.
Yeah, there is a direct little statement within the book that I'd like to read, and it goes on to say, flow creates order and consciousness. It requires voluntary focus and filters out distractions. Our attention becomes fully invested in the task, making life feel meaningful, right? All flow really does is put everything in order, right? It's a step-by-step process when it comes to flow, right? You have to have a challenge. You need to have the skill that matches the challenge, and you need to have the focus in order to achieve and see that challenge all the way through.
Yeah. So breaking down conscious, because I think you're right there too. Breaking down consciousness a little bit more, it's intentionally ordered thoughts, feelings, sensations, etc., in order to control your experiences.
Yes.
So, and I'm gonna probably get in. So try to stay with me here. Your consciousness has a limited capacity. You can only process 126 bits of information per second. And
your attention is limited, right? So you have to use your attention sparingly because you have a limited amount. Like you said, there are 126 bits per second that your brain can take in at a time, right?
Yeah, and just simply talking or listening to someone else takes up 40 bits of information per second. So say me and Chris are walking down a sidewalk and he's telling about this great idea that he has.
Yeah, I've got tons of great ideas.
Tons.
So this isn't like a normal, this is a normal occurrence.
So there's also cars going past, there's birds chirping in the background, there's another passerby with a dog. All these, we're picking up all these through our senses,
Yes.
but like it caps at 126 bits of information. So we use that attention to filter in what we bring into our consciousness.
Yeah. So okay, let me ask you this right now. I saw this famous clip from the Tony Robbins and Theo Von podcast, where Tony Robbins asked Theo Von to look around the room and find all of the things that are green. Right now, find all the things that are green.
Okay.
Okay, how many did you find?
3.
Okay, now, without looking, how many things are yellow? Exactly. There's one thing in this entire room that is yellow, and it's little Clorox wipes. That right there shows you that unless you are focused on that one task, you are going to be oblivious to everything else because you are so focused on finding the one thing that you were asked to do. That was the challenge. And so you had the skill, you had the sense, you had your eyesight in order to evaluate your environment and find that one thing that you were sent or you were supposed to be looking for. But if you're not looking for other things like the yellow Clorox box over there, you don't pay much attention to it, right? That shows you that you only have your attention is very, very limited. So you need to be meaningful when you're using your attention.
Yeah, and I think that was a great description. And it's like a lens of a camera. Like the more you focus on a certain object, then you're going to be dialed into the details of that object, and everything else becomes blurry. So going back to the example that we had, we're walking down the sidewalk, you present an idea. If I'm fully focused on what you're saying and I'm having like great anticipation, excitement because of your idea, obviously my experience is going to be good. Like this conversation that we're having is good because that's my attention is focused on you, and that's what's filtering through into my consciousness.
Yes.
Rather than focus, like for example, I failed a test.
That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
But like if I was thinking about that while you're talking to me, then the experience that we have is going to be bad.
Yes, because you're not paying attention to what I'm saying, right? Your attention is other places. But the author goes on to talk about how having just conversations with people can also get you into that flow state, right? When two like-minded individuals are together and putting all their ideas and all of their intellectual capabilities together, that they can really come up with something unique. And it's solely because of that flow experience, right? We know that there's a challenge out there, that there's a problem that we want to solve, and in order to solve that problem, we need to use our skills, we need to use our strengths in order to solve that issue on hand. But you need to have the attention to detail, rather, to solely focus on that problem.
Yeah.
So,
Sweet.
yeah.
That's all I had for consciousness. You good?
Yeah.
So the last section we'll cover in this part of the episode is a section on enjoyment and quality of life.
And in the book, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he mentioned that there are 8 key conditions that are usually present when someone feels in the flow state.
Yeah, so I have them written down here. The first one is there's a challenge at hand. Second is the merging of action and awareness. 3 and 4 there are clear goals and immediate feedback, and this is important so you're able to track your progress and understand where you're going wrong. 5th is you're deeply involved in the task. 6 is you have a sense of control over your actions and you feel like you're able to impact the events at play. 7th is your self-consciousness is gone, or in other words, awareness of yourself or what your internal thoughts are gone. You're just focused on the external environment. And the last thing is the distortion of time. So hours that go by feel like just minutes.
Yes. And these conditions create a self-contained system where focus, performance, and satisfaction are optimized. But it's important to realize that the challenge and skill balance is the most important of these 8 steps, because if a task is too hard, this causes anxiety. However, if a challenge is too easy, this is what causes boredom.
So let's go through the exercise. Give me a time that you last thought you were in flow, and we'll see if we can check off all these.
Yeah, yesterday I was speaking to a client, and I felt like I was in a flow state. Everything was just coming together, and the conversation that I was able to have with this client was beneficial to both parties. So,
was there a challenge?
Yes, I was
trying to close the deal.
I was trying to sell him something. Yes.
So you were concentrated, or your attention was fully into that conversation.
Yep.
And then obviously a clear goal in terms of
selling the product that I was selling.
And were you getting immediate feedback in terms of his body language or his responses?
Yes. He a lot of times in the field that I work, it's either a quick yes or no. However, with this customer, he was fully engaged in the conversation, and so that gave me a lot of ammunition to use in that negotiation, because he was actually willing to almost get out of his comfort zone and give me the time of day, to say.
And then you're obviously deeply involved in the topic at hand.
Yep.
And you felt like you had a sense of control over what you were saying to him,
and the reason I feel like I was in control of the negotiation is because when you're trying to sell something, you have to be almost like a specialist in that field. And so when you're trying to sell something, you have to come off as if you are the most you have to come off as you know the most about the product than anybody else. And I truly felt like I had that experience when talking to the customer.
And then while you were talking with him, were you thinking about how your life has been recently, or what you're going to have for supper?
Not at all, because I was paying all my attention onto the customer. I was trying to make him feel relaxed and almost making him feel like he was in control of the situation, which is one of the key details that Jim Camp talked about in his negotiation books. So I wasn't focused on anything other than the customer and the challenge at hand.
Yeah, and lastly, just similar to any other conversation, time probably flew.
Yeah, it really did. We ended up having like a 15 or 20 minute conversation, which is very, very rare when it comes to the field that I'm in. And so it really did feel like, although it was only 15 minutes, it felt like 2 seconds to an extent.
Yeah.
But I do feel like I really hit that flow state. And I almost think it takes two parties in order to, or in my field at least, in my experience, that it takes two parties to really get into that flow state. You know, you can ask questions, meaningful questions, and then when they answer that question, you know, you can pick apart their response and find another question to ask. If you can continue to keep that person talking, the better of a conversation you're going to have, and the more likely that you're going to be able to close the deal.
And that was just in your experience, because I feel like you can still hit the flow state individually.
You can definitely hit the flow state individually, but in my specific instance, yes, I did feel like having somebody, you know, being responsive in that conversation was a huge benefit to my flow state. But there are a number of occurrences where you're lonely or you're by yourself and you do find that flow state. Like if you're in a really good book and you simply can't put it down, that's that flow state. You're putting all your attention into that book because what you're reading is meaningful to you. I think that's what it really is. That it has to be meaningful to you.
And do you have any? I got one more thing to cover here for this section. Is he talks about the concept of an autotelic personality, and how I would describe this is you basically control the experiences that you have.
Yeah.
So someone with an autotelic personality is able to take those 8 conditions and bring them into any experience that they have, so they can enter into that flow state. And I just think that, one, I need to probably do a better job, especially with a mundane task of everyday life or things that I'm not really enjoying. Like, how can I implement these 8 conditions and try to get myself into that flow state?
But I almost feel like if you pay too much attention to these 8 conditions, that you're gonna miss the big picture.
Because then you're aware of yourself then, and that's one of the conditions almost.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it's important to really focus on the task that's on hand, right? Because when you put all your focus on that, like we mentioned, everything else around you just kind of disappears, right? You're using all 126 bits of information that you can take per second and putting it towards that task.
Yeah. I still think that autotelic personality is important, though, in terms of
But
bringing enjoyment to any.
Do you want to dive into that a little bit, or
I mean,
let's just introduce the concept right now?
that an autotelic personality is, like how I would describe it, is someone who can bring optimal experience to whatever they're doing.
Okay. What are some traits that these type of people have? You mentioned a couple. First being curiosity and persistence, and then self-discipline and having an inner purpose, right? If you find that you are curious about things, or you like to see a project all the way through, but yet you still have the self-discipline in order to control your actions and your emotions, it almost burns that inner purpose more, right? It's like adding gas to that fire and really seeing it take off. But
Yeah.
we'll kind of dive more into that in a later episode. But other than that,
Yeah. So just as a quick recap, we talked about how the author revisited the concept of happiness. We delved into the anatomy of the consciousness, and then we hit on the initial conditions for the enjoyment and quality of life, which is that flow state or the optimal experience. And next time we'll talk about we'll reintroduce the conditions of flow and a couple more ideas around that, as well as flow in family, people, thought, body, work, etc.
yeah. We'll be breaking this book into 2 separate episodes, surely because of the amount of information within this book is too vast to throw into one episode. It'd be like an hour and a half long. So we will not be having any implementation from this week's, but we will have, do you want to do one quote this episode?
One quote, yeah.
Okay, so moving on to the quotes now. Do you want to hit us off first, or?
Yeah, and I'll read from your computer since I wrote it down. My quote is, "We create ourselves by how we invest the energy of attention." And it goes back to what we were talking about around the anatomy of the consciousness in that section. What we choose to bring our attention towards or use our attention for is ultimately who we're going to become and what we're going to learn along the process. So just be self-reflective of the fact that what you pay your attention to is important.
Yeah, and my quote is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We are always getting to live, but never living.
And I think that goes back to the autotelic personality. Like, how can you live more in every single experience that you are faced with?
And I think that's why it's key to stay in the present moment, right? Otherwise, you kind of forget about the little things, right? You're thinking big picture too much, and you can't celebrate the small little wins that you achieve every single day, well, no matter how big that win is, right? It's important to take time for yourself, and I don't see any bad thing about a little bit of a positive self-talk or a cheerful celebration to an extent, right? You need to celebrate yourself every day. Otherwise, life just gets in the way. And so it's important to stay in the present. But that pretty much wraps up episode 39 of Flow. Don't forget to check us out on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify, all at Bound to Improve. And we will see you next week.